So I had breakfast this morning with Tim Yaton from Red Hat, who's a good friend, and he mentioned, for those of you who were here yesterday, and it sounded like that was most of you, that he had some technical difficulties getting started. So I kind of assumed that I would too, and I'd have 5 to 10 minutes of shuffling around, waiting for the audio to come on, and then I would make some grand pronouncement, and then I would walk off the stage and you'd all clap. But actually, I would like a clap or two or many for Todd Lewis, because when Todd gets up here, wait, let me say something about him first. Although if you want to do a thunderous applause as I speak about Todd, that would be okay too. So when Todd's up here and he's thanking the sponsors, yeah, sponsors are great. I've run an event. You can't do an event without sponsors. He talks about the speakers, we're great too. Talks about the attendees, all great. But the reason that you're here, the reason that I'm up here, the reason the sponsors are here, is because Todd has been working his butt off for many years on making this event fantastic. And I spoke at an early iteration of the event in South Carolina. It was my only chance that I've ever had to go to South Carolina. And Todd was like the most gracious host I have ever met, and he imprinted on my mind that everyone in the South is amazing. I'm reading Chernow's Grant biography right now, and there are some Southerners who maybe weren't as fantastic as Todd Lewis, but Todd is just an amazing guy, and I don't have any idea where he is right now, but Todd, you are the reason that we're all here, and I just think we should give him he's fantastic. Let that not be the last time anyone cheers for Todd. All right, so I'm going to talk about opening up closed things. And you think, oh, Adobe, of course he knows about proprietary software. And I'm not going to talk about Flash. We can talk about that later if you want. I'm not going to talk about why your PDF doesn't open, because I don't know either. In fact, when I first started at Adobe about 3 years ago, I got this series of texts from my brother saying, hey, Matt, call me. I was like, okay, whatever. I was in a meeting, and then I got phone call. I was like, and then I put it through to voicemail, and I got another phone call from him. I'm like, geez, my brother's, maybe one of his kids are dying or something. So I step out of the meeting to take the call. I'm like, Chad, what is it? And he says, I can't get this PDF to open. Can you help me? I said, just try shutting down your computer and restarting, and of course it worked. So no, I'm not going to talk about Flash. I'm not going to talk about PDF. I'm not going to talk about Photoshop. But I am going to talk about something that I've learned over the last few years, which is not how to advance slides. There we go. I am going to talk about how to open up organizations. And we're going to start with the assumption that open is good. And you say, well, we're all at all things open. Of course, we all think that open and open source is fantastic. But one thing that I've learned, at several of the companies that I've been at, and I've been involved, so Safia talked, I think, I'm trying to remember the timeline, but I heard 2 years, and I don't remember if that was the full extent of her experience. My company, at the time, Mitsui, made an investment in Cobalt Networks back in 97, 98. And it was the first time I'd ever heard the word Linux. And then Cobalt, of course, was acquired by Sun Microsystems in, I think, 99, 2000 for about $2 billion. One of the things that helped start off this big mania in open source, at least from a business angle. So that was my first experience with it. But since that time, and I haven't worked at all of these companies, but I've had involvement with a number of them, most recently before joining Adobe at MongoDB, where I ran marketing and community. And one of the things that I've learned is that even in the most open of organizations, and MongoDB just went public on an open source business model, open source, fantastic open source database, but even within Mongo, we had all sorts of discussions about how open we should be. And you know a lot of these conversations around business model, open core or open SOAR, depending on how you think about it. There's always, so we talked about, should we open it up to a foundation? Should we put MongoDB within the arms of a foundation, which has become a popular thing to do? And ultimately decided for a variety of reasons not to. But there was still this question of, well, how do we get more outside contributors? It turns out in the database world, there aren't a lot of people that are super qualified to contribute to the database. So that was a real conversation for us. When I was at Alfresco, a content management company, the discussion was around, should we go with a permissive license like Apache or BSD, or should we go GPL? We went GPL, and the reason was it was the closest thing to a proprietary software license we could find, which sounds kind of funny and maybe annoys some of the people in the room, but that was the discussion. How do we open up without opening up? Was kind of our thinking. To JBoss, for those who have been around for a while, was aggressively policing trademarks to keep people from doing JBoss training. All of these things, in ostensibly open source companies, the variations on that theme of open are pretty broad, pretty wide. I need to start doing my transitions clicking like several seconds before I want to do it. But one thing in any company, whether you work at Red Hat, and where's Jason, right there, whether you work at Red Hat, which probably gets the credit for being the only real open company on the planet, but even at Red Hat, there are discussions about how open should you be, and I think they tend to skew or err on the side of more open. But wherever you are, most companies are here. Your company is here. And so the question is, how do you then open it up? And some are fortunate to have a CEO mandate. And you say, why do you have Amazon up there? They're not an open source company. Well, many people will know about this. I think it was 2002 directive from CEO Jeff Bezos to basically open up how developers communicated internally. Everything's got to be an open service interface. Basically, work internally as if you are communicating with the external world. And I think that helped set up much of the company's success with AWS later. Most people don't have Jeff Bezos to prod them toward this openness. And so for those people, you have Galadriel, who can give you a magic file to open up and lighten your way when all things are dark. But for most of us, it's just going to be a slog. And so what does that slog look like? How do you get from closed to open? And let me just say, without going into any great detail, that this is something of real personal interest to me right now. One way is to go in, and I have tried this, and to say, open source is one. You give a quote from like this Mike Olson quote, the last 10 years, no dominant platform level software infrastructure has emerged in closed source proprietary form. Maybe conveniently overlooking Splunk, but otherwise an accurate statement. And you can go in and you say, and I've tried this at present employer as well as past employers, and say, this is just how it's done. We should do this. Not generally that successful. The other way is to say, we should be more like Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, name your company. They give stuff away, and it's fantastic for them, it works for them, it should work for us. Also not that successful. And why? Because most companies aren't Facebook or Google or LinkedIn. And most companies have infrastructure, legacy infrastructure that they're dealing with, and frankly, culture that they're dealing with, and strategic imperatives that they're dealing with that make this kind of argument hard and ultimately unsuccessful. A better way, and the way that I would suggest for those people in here who are operating in a company where you're trying to figure out, how do I help us to become more open? And I'm guessing many of the people in the room here are developers. Hands? Yeah. So you guys are feted as the new kingmakers by Red Monk, and I think rightly so. This is the argument that I would use and that I am using internally. Software is eating the world. And if you think about for a second who's writing that software, and I'll pause on this long enough for you to appreciate the brilliance of Dilbert. If you think about who's writing that software, it's developers. It's not me over in marketing. It's not the business development group. The group that is eating the world, that's writing that software, is you. And so the question becomes, how do I help you? How do I make more people like you empowered to do more great things? The best source of information on this, I think, is the Red Monk analyst firm. Stephen O'Grady has this fantastic quote: developers are the single most important constituency in technology. And every company is now a technology company, which means developers are the single most important constituency in your company. If you are going to succeed, whether you're, and I love that Capital One is now here. Capital One is a great example of a company that understands that it's a software business. And so they not only come and speak and sponsor events like this, but I know from Jim Jagielski that they are actively doing things internally to empower developers. That is the model that you want to follow. How do we become more like Capital One? How do we become more like Nordstrom, like the various companies that are actively trying to figure out how do we become more software-minded? And really that's a question of how do you get developers. Now the question, one thing in this, in terms of opening up, is it's not necessarily about open source. Often it is, but if you look at those companies over on the right, yes, you have Apache Software Foundation. Yes, you have MySQL, MongoDB, TensorFlow. You also have AWS. And AWS, more than any other company, more than any other thing, to me, expresses what this era of openness is really about. They've taken a lot of flack. I wrote about it recently. They're not open source. They're not as open sourcey as Microsoft Azure. Now that is something that 10 years ago we never ever would have heard from a stage at an open source event, that Microsoft is probably one of the most open sourcey companies around. But it doesn't matter. Think about where developers are flocking. They're flocking to Azure, they're flocking to AWS, they're flocking to Google, but the number one public cloud by far is AWS. And you say, well, how can that be? Developers, you like open source. That's why you're at All Things Open, not at the All Things Cloud conference. Why? Tim O'Reilly said this thing, I think it was in 2006. Tim was usually a few years ahead of the curve, and he talked about being open enough. And he was actually talked about Google Maps as an example of open enough. And that was open API, the data behind it that you could use was reasonably inexpensive, so it was accessible to a large population of developers. It wasn't open source in any real sense. There was no open source license, but it was open enough. And that, I think, is probably at least the initial target to be looking for within your companies, is how do we get this, how do we embrace open enough software, open enough infrastructure, open enough data to empower you, the developers, to do more work. That's not to say that the ultimate goal is not open source, although I would say it really isn't. Open source is a means, not an end. It's a means to greater developer productivity. It's a means to greater developer convenience. But it's not an end in and of itself. Once you have something licensed under the GPL or Apache, you haven't won. You've won when your company is actively, or somebody's actively using that software. And sometimes that means, like AWS has shown, putting it in the cloud, making it super easy to use, etc. So it's really focusing on that convenience. And again, had this interaction with Miles Ward from Google, formerly of AWS, great guy, If we think about some of the best software or the most popular software, as much as we may love open and hate lock-in, look at what has tended to win: Microsoft Office, the iPhone, and then AWS. And then talking with Miles over Twitter, he basically made my argument for me, saying, oh, no, somebody had asked him, what about Spanner? We want to be able to use Spanner. It's closed. And he says, no, it's not. You can, you can use Apache Drill. You've got these other ways of accessing that data. You're not locked in. And they said, well, basically that means we'd have to build our own Google-like data center. He's like, yeah, no problem. That is a problem. Lock-in always exists, so you're only ever really in the cloud where that developer convenience reigns supreme. You're only really going to be able to get open enough. And if we look at the history of open source over the last few years, this is the direction we've been going. And basically, if you look at the shift from, in the red is 2010, blue is 2017. If you look at the shift in licensing from permissive licensing, more restrictive free software licensing like the GPL, there's been a pronounced shift toward Apache and BSD, MIT style licensing. And it's because developers just want convenience. So I would, again, argue, in our quest for opening up your organizations, focus on developer convenience, focus on open enough to make your developers productive. Thank you.